go tweet, 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 rockin' Robin. Tweet, tweet, rockin' Robin. Tweet, tweet. Go rockin' Robin, 'cause we really gonna rock tonight. Every little swallow, every chickadee, every little bird in the tall oak tree. The wise or loud, the big black crow, flap of their wings, singing go bird, go rockin' Robin. Tweet, tweet, rockin' Robin. Tweet, tweet. Go rockin' Robin, 'cause we really gonna rock tonight. A pretty little raven at the birdman stand, talking about the pop and it was grand. They started going steady and bless my soul. He out popped the buzzard and the oriole. He rocks in the treetop all the day long, popping and a popping and a singing his song. All the little birds on Jaybird Street love to hear the robin go tweet, 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 rockin' Robin. Tweet, tweet, rockin' Robin. Tweet, tweet. Slow rockin' Robin, 'cause we're really gonna rock tonight. Well, the pretty little raven at the birdman stand taught him how to do the pop and it was grand. They started going steady and bless my soul. He out-popped the buzzard and the oriole. He rocks in the treetop all the day long, hopping and a bopping and a singing his song. All the little birds on Jaybird Street love to hear the robin go tweet, 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 rockin' Robin. Tweet, tweet, rockin' Robin. Tweet, tweet. Slow rockin' Robin, 'cause we're really gonna rock tonight.
Sometimes, when she caught a glimpse of herself in one of the stained glass windows with the 3 black angels, and her hair was lopsided, and her mirror had fooled her into thinking she had on just enough powder, but not too much, when in fact her skin resembled a heavy layer of dust over a rusted African mask. It was then that she felt like exactly who she was, the old Reverend's unmarried daughter, long time unmarried daughter. A pew of aged black wood, splintered, holding her breath, waiting for her moment of redemption. On certain Sundays, she felt like her younger self, a 12-year-old in a dress big enough to hold tomorrow, if tomorrow would ever come. If a mother had been there, she'd have seen the old reverend's daughter seal her hymnal to her chest to lock all the music inside. If a mother had been there, she'd have heard the old reverend's daughter flying suddenly off key as though some unseen terror had leapt at her throat mid-song. If a mother had just stepped beyond her own secrets, surely she would have found a way to wrap some kind of joy round and round the cheeks of the old reverend's daughter. But for 12 birthdays, no letter, no card. The old reverend told her, "Turn it over to Jesus. He's all you'll ever need." The old reverend's daughter hoped that when she outgrew her winter shoes and her spring coat, she'd also outgrow ever needing to know which corner of the world held her mother captive, refused to let a mother escape. 12 turned to 20. 20 to 40, 40 to 50, and by the time the old reverend died, he'd been the only man who'd lived in her heart. By 50, she'd learned to be grateful for years of Sunday mornings. By 50, she no longer glanced back over a young girl's shoulder. She no longer called up strong brown arms that would wake up all the spaces the old reverend had never filled. She fastened in daydreams. She ironed away all useless reverie. She couldn't help but sing louder than the choir when they sang, "It is well with my soul." He was wearing a navy blue suit and a starched dress shirt she'd ironed for this day. The old reverend seemed to release her, not abandon, but release. And in her pew, the pew she'd sat in for her whole life, she hummed and rocked and rocked and hummed and stared up to the 3 black angels. And when she thought nobody was looking, she swiftly lifted her white-gloved hand to her cheek to pat away some of the powder. She sang, "Dear Reverend Father, it is well with my soul."
A reading from the book of 2 Samuel. Hear what God's Spirit is saying to you. David danced before the Lord with all his might. David was girded with a linen ephod. So David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and with the sound of the trumpet. As the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, looked out of the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. They brought in the ark of the Lord and set it in its place, inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And David offered burnt offerings and offerings of well-being before the Lord. When David had finished offering the burnt offerings and the offerings of well-being, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts and distributed food among all the people, the whole multitude of Israel, both men and women, to each a cake of bread, a portion of meat, and a cake of raisins. Then all the people went back to their homes. David returned to bless his household, but Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David and said, "How the king of Israel honored himself today, uncovering himself today before the eyes of his servants' maids, as any vulgar fellow might shamelessly uncover himself." David said to Michal, "It was before the Lord who chose me in place of your father and all his household to appoint me as prince over Israel, the people of the Lord, that I have danced before the Lord. I will make myself yet more contemptible than this, and I will be abased in my own eyes. But by the maids of whom you have spoken, by them I shall be held in honor." Here ends the reading of words that give us insight on God. May God grant to us wisdom and courage for interpretation.
When I was in high school, some of my best friends were members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We discovered that we didn't have a ton in common theologically, but one piece of common ground we had was love of dancing. So I went to prom a couple of years in a row with a girl who was a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And she loved to dance. We had a great time. And she invited me to her church for a church dance. And I've got to admit, I was a little apprehensive about that. I mean, what exactly do you do at a church dance? Are you going to dance to hymns? What's that going to look like? And I was from a part of the country that we lovingly, or maybe not so lovingly, referred to as the buckle of the Bible Belt. That means that when most churches were talking about dance, they were talking about dance as a one-way ticket straight to hell. The town that was next to the one I grew up in was a town that had outlawed dancing, just like in the movie. Help me with the name. Footloose. Footloose. How could I forget the name of that movie? Footloose. So it wasn't a place where everyone danced. But I went to this church social hall for this LDS church dance, and my apprehension quickly began to fade away because I recognized the music. It was pop music. Now, it was carefully curated pop music. They were very careful not to have any inappropriate language, and whenever we entered into the church social hall, they reminded everyone to leave room for Jesus when you were dancing. But it was clear that people loved dancing there. In fact, some of the songs, you can tell they had listened to a lot because they broke into choreographed dance. It was a bit like watching a musical. I was in awe a little bit. A tradition that loved dancing. In fact, as it turns out, in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, dancing was always an important part. They saw dancing as a way of being joyful before God. It was seen as a way of honoring God. And I thought that was very interesting because I loved to dance. As I said, we didn't agree on much theologically, but dance, we agreed on. Love to dance. You know, whenever I recognized that you could move, and moving could be a spiritual practice, that was incredibly life-giving to me, because I'm sure in a revelation that will surprise none of you, I have a hard time sitting still. And a lot of times whenever we talk about spiritual practices, we're talking about practices that are introspective, that are still. And I appreciate those, and those have been very important to me, and I have a really hard time doing them. I'm much better at being active and continuing to move. And so when I recognized that movement could be a spiritual practice, that was life-giving to me. Movement can be something as intricate as a liturgical dance in church, or it could be as simple as going for a walk or a run, or having a conversation with a friend. I've come to see those conversations as prayers. It can be as simple as swinging a hammer with Amore Ministries here on our campus and building a house for those in need, or walking into your senator and representative's office and demanding justice, or going out in the street and marching for a cause. Movement can be a spiritual practice, you see. Movement can be sacred. Today's scripture lesson is all about movement. In this scripture lesson, we see the Ark of the Covenant being moved into Jerusalem, into David's city. Now, I don't know how much you know about the Ark of the Covenant. Perhaps what you know of it is what you've learned from Raiders of the Lost Ark. And I don't know if the Ark really had Nazi face-melting powers or not, but here's what it was said to contain. The tablets that had the Ten Commandments on them, the rod of Aaron. Moses and Aaron were both supposed to have had walking sticks that were imbued with certain powers during the plagues. Remember, Moses is said to have used his rod to split the Sea of Reeds, and his brother Aaron had a rod too, and it was supposed to have been in the Ark of the Covenant. And a bowl filled with holy manna, the bread from heaven that rained down from the sky during those 40 years of wilderness wandering. Now, whether those things were actually in there and they did what they were supposed to have done or not, who knows? What I do know is that the Ark of the Covenant was seen as a symbol of God, more than a symbol, actually. It was supposed to be God's literal presence on earth. In fact, whenever they built a temple, they built the temple around the Ark of the Covenant. So there were several layers in this temple, and you would go in, and with each layer, you would get holier and holier until you entered the innermost sanctum, the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant was. And it was thought that God, that Yahweh, literally lived in there. Not like in the way that, oh yeah, God is present in church that we talk about today. No, they thought God was really in there with the Ark of the Covenant. So whenever David brought the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem, he was solidifying his power. He was solidifying his power as king and as high priest. So it was a political and a theological move to make sure that the Ark of the Covenant came into Jerusalem. This was important because David really had no business being on the throne. Remember, he was the youngest son of Jesse. He should have never become king. It wasn't until that monumental moment with Goliath that he was catapulted into fame in his country and eventually became the king. But if you had looked at David growing up, you would have never thought that he had any way of ever going to the throne. But he consolidates his power. He moves the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem. And in doing so, he becomes the ideal king for Israel. In fact, a lot of people forget about the guy who came before him, Saul, the first king of Israel. I remember being in a Bible class in college, and the teacher said, "Who was the first king of Israel?" And I shot my hand up and I said, "Oh, it was David." She said, "What about Saul?" I said, "Oh yeah, Saul. I forgot about that guy." And you see, that's how much of Israel viewed their kingship. David is the king. David is the ideal king. We even trace Jesus' lineage back to David, not to Saul. And so David is moving the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem, and he sees this moment and he feels overwhelmed with joy because all of a sudden things are coming together. And he is so overcome with joy that he starts to dance. And it was controversial because David was wearing an ephod, which is a linen apron. It's what the priests wore, usually over their clothes. But apparently David was wearing that apron and that apron alone as he began to dance in the streets. People weren't quite sure what to make of that, including David's spouse. And so when David went home, she looks him up and down, and she says, How the King of Israel has honored himself today. This is a biblical precedent for using sarcasm to speak to your significant other. And then she lays into him for the rest of the chapter. See, I told you that the Bible is relatable. David, scantily clad dances. And scantily clad dancing aside, we see two types of movement in this story. We see the movement of the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem. We see David being filled with joy and dancing. Movement can be sacred. Dancing can be sacred. I recognize that our ability to move and to dance can be different from one person to the next. We have mobility issues. We have age that sometimes can bring pain with movement. A few weeks ago, I was standing over here on the corner by Alibi on University, and I was about to cross the street, and there was someone in a wheelchair and then someone pushing them. And they both started to sing while they were waiting. And then the person who was pushing began to dance. And both of their faces lit up, and their joy was contagious. I think one of the reasons that we come together on Sunday morning is because we lift our voices together, we clap together as we can, we try to do it on the 2 and the 4, and sometimes we succeed and sometimes we don't. We come together in community, and in doing so, in doing that movement together, we are uplifted and inspired. As I said, I know that with age can come pain as well, and pain can prohibit movement. And so this week I was thinking about Julian of Norwich, who could relate to that. Julian of Norwich began to suffer chronic pain when she was 30 years old, and it was so bad that she thought she was going to die. And so the priest came in to administer last rites. And she was laying in her bed, the priest was administering the last rites, and she saw the crucifix, and she began to fix on that. And she began to have vivid visions of Jesus' passion. She had a bit of a turnaround in terms of health. And she began to use a body prayer to help her deal with the pain. And it's the body prayer that we did earlier in the service. And so I'd like to invite you to do that with me again, as you're able, to place your feet flat on the ground, to straighten up your back if you can, and to cup your hands in front of you, await. Await God's presence, not as you expect, hope, or imagine, but just as it is in this moment. Await. Then to reach your hands up and allow. Allow a sense of God's presence to come or not, and to be whatever it is. Then to cup your hand over your heart, accept. Accept as a gift whatever comes or does not come. And to outstretch your hand to attend. Attend to what God has called you to do. Await. Allow. Accept. Attend. And so this week, I invite you to attend to whatever it is that God has given to you, to be out moving in the world, to whatever it is that God has called you to do. Perhaps you might try a body prayer this week. You can Google and find this one or one of the others. There are many of them. Some of them are simple. They just concentrate on how you're praying, say folding your hands or placing your hands in a prayer position, or even opening your palms. Some encourage you to bow your head and close your eyes, others to lift up your head and open your eyes towards the sky. Some involve kneeling, some involve walking. Some involve walking on a labyrinth. I know that some of you have done that, and there are various places to do that in town. And I was thinking about labyrinths this week because labyrinth is a prayer exercise that involves movement. And whenever we walk labyrinths in our day and age, we typically think about, trying to say a Bible verse or a prayer over and over again, or even to clear our mind and to let God's Spirit wash over us. And those are all well and good. But do you know how they think labyrinths were originally used? They trace labyrinths back to the 4th century, and they believe, according to written evidence, that they were originally used for dancing. The priests would dance during the Easter vigil. So this week, I invite you to attend, to move out in the world, to whatever God has given you to do. Perhaps it is praying, perhaps it is walking, perhaps it is conversations, or maybe you just feel like dancing. But whatever you do, move with God's Spirit out in the world. Thanks be to God, and may it be so.